Good morning, ladies and gentlemen in the room and those following us online for this session. My name is Frédéric Lelièvre. I am the CEO and Editor-in-Chief of the Swiss business media l'AGFI. I have the privilege to moderate this roundtable organized by Edmond Rothschild Real Estate Investment Management. In the recent years, in the context of energy transition, most of the ESG focus has been around the environmental performance of the real estate assets, in particular the energy transition and the carbon emissions. However, there's a growing expectation from the communities, the population, and of course the investors to deal with the social impact of real estate. And this is precisely the topic that we're going to cover in this roundtable. We will structure the discussion in three parts. First, we will define exactly what kind of social impact we are talking about. Second, we'll see how much of a big role the public sector plays here. We'll cover the standards, for instance, that are available, the public-private corporations. Third, we will address the big question of the financial payout of this social impact real estate asset class. Our panelists will share different views in relation to the dynamics in various countries, including Switzerland, the UK, Germany, and the Netherlands. We will, of course, have time to take questions directly from you and to our panelists. So let me introduce our speakers. Sitting next to me is Nicolas DiMaggio. You are the CEO of the Zurich-based Swiss Finance and Property. It's an investment company and advisory company specializing in real estate with a focus on asset management. So you'll share with us the investor's view. Welcome, Nicolas. Next to you, Bert-Jan Schäfer. You're head of business and product development at Edmond Rothschild Reim. You have over 15 years of experience in real estate, mostly as an institutional investor. Now, you provide us with the insights from the product development perspective. Welcome to you too. Next to you is François Yeni, Head of Research and Consulting for the French-speaking part of Switzerland at CBRE, a leading consulting company in residential and commercial real estate. Who best than you to share with us the latest market trends? Last but not least, Martin Vlasveld, your Head of ESG at Edmond Rothschild Reim with a strong experience in real estate portfolio and asset management. Let's stay with you to start the conversation, Martin, and to set the scenes. We have a few slides and pictures for you. Explain us what exactly we are talking about when it comes to social impact, real estate investment. You have about six minutes, let's say 6 minutes to start with.
Thank you very much, Frédéric. Yeah, we translated, or if you look at the PRI, who translated the kind of United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, which are kind of the basis of impact investing, to the impact investing teams with their market map. For real estate, there are basically two themes that are relevant. It's green buildings. I think we all know it. We saw it also on the first slide here, and the challenge: how to make buildings using less energy, how to decarbonize them. And the other, you see a lot of that in the market now. The next step, and what you see now also coming up, is affordable housing. It's the other big theme that you see in the 10 that PRI identified. That's, I think, the next theme. You see affordable housing coming up a lot, especially since in the past years, cities have become much more expensive. And also a lot of people with lower incomes having difficulties to afford living in those cities. In the past year, I think with the rising energy prices, this will be even more relevant. But for social, and I think it counts for all social investments, it's always difficult to measure that. So we have thought about that quite a lot, and especially our UK team. They have been active in affordable housing for the past 7 years, I think. And they developed a framework, also built on the Sustainable Development Goals, around social housing and affordable housing. Of course, they focus on the first sustainable development goals to decrease the poverty. That's for social and affordable housing, of course, really relevant. Health and well-being, of course, also sustainable cities, and also inclusive cities. How do you make sure that the cities, and especially the nicer cities, will be not only cities for the wealthy people, but also for a broader range of citizens in the country. And of course, I think it's always linked to impact investing. You need to make it also environmentally sustainable. So it's always essential to focus on buildings using less energy, using clean energy, and being really climate, have a lot of climate-related actions, and being also responsible with the consumption and the materials that you use. How do you measure it? Well, they use 4 characteristics for that. Social need, of course. So what they do, what is typical for affordable housing is investing in areas with a lot of people with lower incomes, where there's a lot of social needs. So not in the wealthy areas. It's easy to invest in, of course, the house prices are higher. But investing in areas where the house prices are also a bit lower, where there's a lot of needs, so lower income families, make the rent also affordable for them. So the second big theme is, of course, affordability. So a lower rent than market, either in the social segment, which is the lowest segment, or the affordable segment, which is kind of just below the middle segment. Additionality, so building, constructing buildings that would have been there for the affordable segment anyway. That's also really important. And quality of management, of course. And I think people will also know that some schemes, especially the cheap ones, are not managed properly. We think it's really important. Also, if you offer buildings at the lower end, still to manage it really well, to measure that also in tenant satisfaction surveys, and also surveys for the property manager and how the quality is. Now, what do they do? I think 2 types: general needs. So that's more the social rent, affordable rent, but also shared ownership, so that you can, if you can't afford a whole house, that you can buy a part of it, and that the rest, which you can't afford, that you rent that. And then if you earn a bit more, if you save a bit more, that you can buy another share of your house. And the specialist housing types. Extra, so more care, homelessness, and supported living for the elderly, for instance. We have 3.
So that's part of for the theoretical view,
Yeah.
on social impact real estate, and then you have a few examples to share with us what it actually can look like.
Yeah, this is in the UK, of course, the specialist, and we built it with YMCA in an area where there are a lot of people homeless. So together with them, we developed a building for people who are homeless who can stay here. In total, there are about 80 beds there, about 42 bedrooms. And in the end, how do you also make that a kind of social investment? We leased that to the organization that runs it. They sign a lease. They also get government support, of course, and we rented it to that organization. So in that way, it's also structured as a good investment with a social return too.
This one, where is this one?
It's Island Point. Actually, there are 3 of them. You've got Island Point, one in London even. But these are more the general needs, so the affordable housing, so offering housing at lower rates, lower rents than actually would have been in a normal market. So you see it also new construction. I think all 3 of them, new constructed buildings, high quality, but leased at a lower rate than average. Also developed it together with the developer to make sure that you also give a social return back. And the last one is more specialist, so this is more the care apartments. At the left one, this is more for the elderly and people needing additional care. And at the right, you see assisted living, so people with disabilities or having troubles to live on their own, but are still in this way assisted also because there's a management room also next to it and can still live in the smaller houses. So there's always a combination between renting out these apartments at a lower rate and offering also additional services.
You picked 3 examples from the UK.
Yeah.
Is the UK in advance in that area in Europe, or just the good examples that you found?
Yes and no. I think on the continent are a bit more social housing corporations. Germany is quite large for that. I think Netherlands also. You have the social housing corporations. You have that less in the UK. So you see in the UK, the affordable housing sector is a bit more developed, where pension funds step in. So they take on that role. I think also because the government takes on that role a bit less. And that's why the government market is developed. Oh, the affordable housing segment is developed more in the UK. Pension funds step in more. But you see also this now happening across Europe.
Okay, thank you. Interesting point. We may come back in the second part of the discussion on the role of the public sector in developing such a kind of project. Let me now turn to Nicholas. As an investor, for you, what exactly is social impact real estate?
Thank you for the question. Welcome to everybody. I think the mindset about social investments has quite changed in the last 10 years. We were only focused on affordable housing in the past, and now social investments are much broader. I will take a few examples. We talk much more about biodiversity, about community, about connectivity to public transport or inside a big area, and this is mainly the change which occurs in the market. At the same time, in Switzerland, if we look back, a lot of funds have been created with ESG in their name, green, responsible, sustainable, and it's only now in 2021, 2022 that the FINMA started. I mean, they started much before, but that really ask concretely, if you put that in your marketing package, it has to be also in your strategy. And that's for us investors, of course, the transparency we get now from the provider in terms of social investment, much better than it used to be in the past. And for investors, that means they can invest being aware of where they put the money, and that's the most important for us.
Mm-hmm. And what kind of examples do you have to share with us to show what it looks like?
So I took 2 examples, not from, and I will. So that's our first one. That's a fund, a real stone.
So where is this one located?
So this is in Lake Geneva, Lake Zurich area in Horgen. So it's 20 minutes from Zurich, and it was an old industrial area, and they decided they bought it from Credit Suisse. They made a huge investment there, and they could build a lot of building. But here what was interesting is that they were in close discussion with the community, with the city. They could also get a new train station directly at this area, which makes this place great. And they also emphasize on the biodiversity with a park. They've been aware of having a mix of building with smaller house, smaller apartments, bigger one for families. So really a great mix with a good connectivity.
Yeah, this is about to be completed, or
it will be completed. The first step has been completed end of Q3, and
with no delay.
With
no delay, there's some.
With no delay, they respected the timeline. That was quite impressive for this kind of project. But yeah.
So the social impact here, to sum up, is there's energy that we mentioned, but the social is the mix of type of housing. That's the key element.
I think it's less about affordable housing and much more about the mix and the community and the living together. Yes.
So meaning that you have some expensive flats or housing and way cheaper ones, but then that you manage to have all those people living together.
That's the key element of this project, and of course, with new building, you can be quite efficient in the structure of your flats, and with less square meter, also have a family of 4 or 5 living in a flat with a rent level which is acceptable.
I forgot if you have a second example.
And the second
Yeah,
example,
you have one.
it's
So where is this one? Zurich still?
so that's in Zurich, and that's another fund which did it. They had some cheap housing, so that was affordable housing, and they had a reserve to build an additional building. And also here they emphasize on the community, and as all the rest was quite small household, they decided to build wooden structure for families, and so bigger flat, but which bring this diversity of type of household living together again.
Okay, so the social mix is again here the key difference compared to a classic real estate project.
That's exactly the case, and that's also what makes it perhaps a bit more difficult to measure it for us. At what is really the social impact? What do you take as key metrics to?
How do you measure it?
I think it's much more, I mean, if we look at social investment, it's much more about a secure cash flow for the long term more than a short-term capital gain. And that's for us, I think, when we go and we start to discuss about social investment, it's much more about the long-term security, low vacancy rate, steady cash flows more than the short-term capital gain. Because they will invest more, perhaps the structure will cost a bit more. I mean, if you do a park, it will cost a bit more, but long-term, I think, in the market, that will be also places which will have lower vacancy rates.
And in terms of criteria, so you have a threshold that you want to have X% of the housing of that kind. Do you have to have this social mix, or what kind of metrics do you use?
I mean, in Switzerland, then it's always also the case if you have some specific fund targeting only social investments and which will be classified like that, or if you have diversified portfolio which have been built in the last 50 years and they are now adding step by step some project. And for us, it's much more about the direction more than only having some social products.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to François at CBRE. Give us a broader view and what kind of trends do you see on the market at the moment?
Well, I guess after having faced uncertainty in the face of the pandemic and COVID, markets are now facing uncertainty due to kind of geopolitical, economic, and financial concerns. So it's maybe hard to give an overriding trend. I think uncertainty is probably the kind of key word now. But as the examples that Martin has showed in terms of kind of mega trends that I think we have to keep in mind when we're thinking about social impact real estate, I think the aging of population, certainly in almost all European countries, that's certainly a key trend. And the other thing is kind of individualization of people's needs and wants. So if you're trying to do a project that's going to cater to this and this target group, it's important to be quite precise in what you're going to be building in order for the users to be satisfied of the project that you're going to be building up. And then, of course, as Martin was also saying, growing inequality is a risk in all of our attractive cities. It's harder and harder for low-income people or families to find housing that is both comfortable and affordable. So those are, I suppose, are the key trends that have to be kept in mind when thinking about social impact real estate.
And you also have a few slides to share with us on what's the actual situation when it comes to housing allocation.
Yeah, this is a slide that I like to show because it attracts attention to something that's kind of underestimated sometimes, and that is who we're actually building for and who is actually going to be occupying the housing that's being put on the market. So as you can see from the graph, the one on the left is who lives where, and the one on the right is who moves into what.
And those are data from 2021 or?
Yeah, this is an aggregate data for several cities based on population and housing, and the statistics are from the Federal Office of Statistics here in Switzerland, but it's fairly representative of what you can find in most, at least Swiss countries. So just the two things I want to attract your attention to is that not all large apartments are occupied by large, family groups or a large number of people. So we can consider that either as a luxury or a misallocation of resources, but there's certainly a subject there. And when we talk about the kind of, I guess, public policy aspect of things, it'll be interesting to see that sometimes there are constraints as to how many people have to go into what kind of apartment types. And for other social housing schemes, there's actually no conditions as to who gets to go where. So if you're building something that's kind of, state helped, and you're actually building a 5-room apartment for 2 people or 1 person, are you really attaining a sustainable goal or not? And the other thing that's important to keep in mind is that people change over time. So given, a kind of mix of typologies in a development, well, it can be, taken up by families, which will be what you're hoping for. And then, of course, after 10 years, say the children will have left and you'll have empty nesters that are left. So what should you do at that point? Is it sustainable to let these people stay where they are, which would be obviously one thing that you could think, or is it more sustainable to maybe encourage them to move into something that's more adapted to their actual spatial needs and let another family come and replace them? So I don't have any answers, obviously. Different schemes have different philosophies, but it's important to bear that in mind when we're talking about the space that each of us needs to live in, and those spaces that need to be built up and then heated and then, maintained and things like that. I guess that's just a real question, I think, of exactly how much space we want to build for everyone, since building space consumes land and obviously energy.
That's what the figures show. So it's if we can just spend a couple of minutes more on those. If we take just the house data and we see where people live, and the families, only 18% of the families actually live in house, but when they have the opportunity to move to a different housing type, 50%, right? 50% of them choose to move to a house. So it shows when they can. Clearly a strong demand there, right?
Exactly. Although I suppose even though we showed houses here in Switzerland, as some of you may know, it's mostly a kind of rental market. So and most public housing schemes are actually collective housing. So what you're saying about the houses is obviously true, but it's a kind of minority situation here in Switzerland. And houses, usually if they're sub-occupied, it's because the children have left and the parents are there. So if you're an owner, then obviously there's a real incentive to stay in your property, which is why I was more commenting on the kind of collective housing and the larger apartment types in a rental scheme and a social rental scheme, where you can have, after a couple of years, a real misallocation of these resources and a sort of underwhelming effect on the social use of that development after a certain amount of time.
Thank you very much, François. Let's finish up this first part with Bertian. Great, there's could be some investment to be made. But what kind of product does it imply? What's your view on this new, I guess we can call it asset class? Maybe it's a niche now, like what Nicolas said, but it seems to be growing, social impact real estate.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Welcome to all. I'm not sure whether it's new, actually. I think there's more emphasis on it right now. But if I look at how we are scanning new products, new business development, what we've always done, and what we're still doing, is we're always trying to put the end user at the heart of any strategy. Because similar to what Nicolas just was saying, is if the end user is happy and we cater for the well-being of the end user, whether that's a resident in an apartment or in a house, or whether that's an office user, an employee, if the end user is happy and he's looked after properly, basically your vacancy risk is lower. Mm-hmm. Your rents probably are more sustainable. Your building probably is also more attractive if at some point you actually want to sell that to another investor. Right, so from a pure business perspective, I think this just makes a lot of sense. And I think social impact, to me personally, what is interesting about it is it's really micro level on the one hand, so that's the end user. But then sort of like it's a community effect, right? If you design a building, it has an impact on the community, immediately surroundings. So that's maybe landscaping. Maybe services or amenities that you have in a building that cater to not only the building users itself, but to the sort of the surroundings as well. But it's also society at large. right? So biodiversity, sort of landscaping, green roofs, those kind of elements. And if you all sort of put that into one mix, I think it's fantastic that you can put something that basically benefits individuals to society at large, while still sort of lowering your overall risk level and essentially generating interesting returns. Which essentially, because oftentimes sort of it's forgotten, but oftentimes we actually invest on behalf of pension plans, then invest on behalf of the ultimate pension.
They expect some return. We'll get back to the financial return a bit later on, but let's stick to when you design a product. And when I was asking Nicholas what kind of metrics to use to actually prove that it has or it aims at having a social impact, would you have a checklist that it has to be this kind of criteria, precise criteria? How do you design this?
And again, similar to what was mentioned earlier, it's very, very difficult to really put a specific metric on it. And I think it has to do also with the heterogeneity of the real estate asset class. If we don't put the social impact at the heart of our strategy, the building probably would have been different, but I have no clue assessing what the vacancy would have been in that scenario. Right? We just fundamentally believe that we're doing the right thing and that we're doing something that has just sort of common sense, business sense.
So it wouldn't be useful to compare to the average vacancy rate in the area, and then you expect to be above that?
Absolutely. But that's sort of at specific points in time, right? So, of course, when you design a project, deliver it, you hope to have 100% occupancy, which then by nature is probably higher than the market average. But the question is, what would it be 10 years later? And you just have to take a stance, right? You have to have sort of a belief and a conviction and execute on that. And sometimes you just can't measure everything up front. But you have to have the conviction to do it and execute on it.
And when you design those products, how do you see the differences among the different countries in terms of regulation? And that brings us to the second part of the discussion. What kind of standards, are there any standards available at the moment, or maybe they are in the UK or in the Netherlands where you're based, or in other countries to provide the investors with transparency and in the end accountability to is my product really, or my investment really delivering a social impact?
I think you have to differentiate, I think, between the different real estate sectors. And on the office sector, I think for us, we're looking at the tenants, so the office users. And I think by and large across Europe, they're looking for the same type of product. Right, they're looking for spaces that sort of are well amenitized, where people can mingle, interact socially, that focus on the well-being of their talent, because those companies have to attract talent, and we all know in today's market it's incredibly difficult. So I think it's not so much regulation, but it's really sort of what the office users want, and that's relatively similar, I think, across markets. When talking about residential, it's completely different for each country, right? Because every country has its own set of specific regulations, whether that's related to social housing, affordable housing. Martijn already mentioned that in the UK there's much more private sector involvement in the ownership of the homes, and there's an entire sort of public body around it with registered providers that basically sign the long-term leases. In the Netherlands, that's completely different, where basically all the stock is owned more in semi-government entities. In Germany, it's different. So there you really have to, on the residential side, look at local legislation.
It's very interesting that you bring the office in the discussion, because I believe none of you yet has spoken about office spaces, mostly focusing on housing. Martin, is there any social impact to have in real estate when you build new office spaces?
Yeah, but I think for offices it's much more on it is the commercial real estate space, so the counterparts that you...
Or commercial, yes, could be...
Yeah, the counterparts that you're negotiating with are also really commercial, so it's not more the lower rent, but you focus more on the attractivity of the building, like Bejan also said, on the health and well-being of the people. So making sure, of course, that the building is good, but also there are a lot of services around it. And that so if you want to make a building really attractive, services like a sports a gym in the basement, but also amenities nearby, and that's where we focus on more to make make it more social. But you don't see that much social investments in offices next to making it a really nice place where you can go to, or having a good lunch, a healthy lunch. Yeah, and it's not more making it for at a lower price, because I think with offices it's really location dependent. If you're in the city center, then or the business district, it's really expensive. If you move a couple of kilometers away, it can be really cheap. So it's not the affordable housing for offices. It's much more making the building attractive and social services.
Nicolas, you have to add on that, is office space also an option for social impact real estate?
I think it is. We can see it that way. I mean, what makes a city great and resilient also in downturn is the diversity of activities. We have great example, or great, perhaps not so great, in the US, where some sectors got into trouble. What was the impact at a city level in terms of criminality and everything else? So what is important is that cities bring this diversity, and we can think about startup. It's difficult to bring 50 startups at once in a building, but you can discuss with the public sector, you can find agreement, and they can support also creating a cluster in a region, in a building, which will bring step by step new startup in your building. We have an example at Swiss Finance Property in the Etikon, where the city of the Etikon created this clean tech hub with the idea of bringing some startup in the building. That
so within the city and not mostly in the suburbs, like it's often the case.
So it's in one building. They had a process. They selected one building. They got a floor of a big building, which are secure for them, and they can bring the companies in the coming years step by step. And for from a city perspective, so that they allocate a budget for that, and that's the idea of in 5 years' time having 10 or 15 more companies in the city, paying then perhaps also taxes when they will be successful.
Mm-hmm. So that's the social goal of having companies coming back or staying at the heart of the city. And you see this in the Etikon or only, or in other areas as well? It reminds me that in Zurich there was this blockchain hub because there was a big vacancy in a building, and you had all those blockchain people suddenly on Bahnhofstrasse. It was close to Bahnhofstrasse for a couple of years, but I don't remember it was with the social impact goal in mind.
Yeah, I will not make this link between the crypto and the social investment, but we see different initiatives, and this is perhaps one, but I'm not so aware of it.
François, you'd like to add something?
Yeah, I think I just wanted to rebound on something Bertian was saying about the kind of community impact, even of commercial real estate, because I think the question of what the ground floor is used for, obviously, is going to condition very strongly how impactful the development will be. If the ground floor is totally privatized, then what we're actually creating in a city is a space that's just belonging to one company, and if there's security involved and gates and things like that, then we're kind of extracting a piece of the city from the city. So I think a socially impactful commercial real estate development should have a real thought process around what's going on with the ground floor and how much of the ground floor can be left public, so to speak. So the different programs that are going to be imagined in the ground floor are something that's really important to consider, because that's the way that I guess the building and the community is going to be able to interact with the different people. And one example from Europa Alley, which maybe some of you know in Zurich, it's a rather large development that was also done in one of these old kind of train depot things. They have a scheme where some of the spaces kind of subsidize the other spaces. So if you have like these social activators, certain things maybe can't pay so much rent, but at least you can go and have a healthy lunch, as Martin was saying. And so maybe they'll be paying a little less because in the global scheme, they were able to recoup the rent on other actors. So if you kind of create an ecosystem of people and you have rents that are kind of variable, then you can have these social activators, which are really important, because it's not necessarily what activates the public space the most that's going to generate the most revenue. So if you can mix them intelligently, then you're going to have a building that's going to be well anchored in its community, I think.
Well, you bring again the topic of the role the public sector plays to organize this. Martin, in your view, how important is the public sector role at the moment, and how do you interact with public authorities as a private company?
Yeah, it is quite a difficult question, and it differs a lot per city, per country, I think. And some cities are really active on especially integrating the buildings in the city and to make it really lively. Some of them are also really active on affordable housing or social housing, making a lot of rules where you need to comply with. And in some spaces it's really good because it makes sure that your buildings, that you're in several segments, that you you have to build also the lower price segment, the mid-price, and partly the higher price segment. You see also several countries and cities being quite advanced and also further than the European Commission on the climate side. They really say, okay, your building needs to be, say, kind of Paris-proof, but also not only in energy, but also use the roofs for kind of a roof garden and not just make it black. A kind of black and that nobody gets there, but make it as a roof garden, make it as a solar. And they say, okay, you're obliged to put also solar panels on it to generate a bit of green electricity. So it differs really a lot per city. The cities are more active in it, or the governments are more active in it. Yeah, they tend also to.
Which cities would be more active? I understand from what you're saying that it's very local. It very much depends. Every city would bring a different situation. And which cities would you give us as a good example of regulation norms or help to develop this kind of social impact real estate projects?
Yeah, well, I know it by heart from Amsterdam. You can see it happening there, and of course, I'm coming from Amsterdam. But what you see there, what they do is that they, to developers, they really agree on that you need to have a strict percentage of, say, 40% social rent, 40% affordable, and 20% free rent or liberalized rent. And sometimes you can discuss about that if you add more green amenities to the building. But what they also do is say, okay, of course you have the Paris-proof norms, but you really, what I told, you really need to involve your community and also use your roof, use your ground floor to make it attractive, and really focus on that. Those are the active cities. Sometimes you can also just build what you want, and then you have to do it yourself. And for an investor, if you're active on that, you can make a difference. Because some investors will just say, okay, build the building and I will rent it with a 10 years lease contract and we'll see afterwards. Yeah, that's not so good for the community and for the environment. But you can make, as an active investor, you can make a real difference. I think, yeah, you see that in the first slide, you said there was a building in Milan. I think Milan.
We could go back to the slide for the presentation with the green
the green forest in the buildings. Milan is really active in that. So you have several cities working on that. Paris, I think, is in several parts active on that. But it really differs per city.
Yes, Bastian?
No, I think it's an incredibly fine balance. And I think we can all agree that there's many places in Europe where basically there's a shortage of affordable homes. And you see sort of different cities, different countries taking different measures, and it's tough, right? Because if you are too restrictive in terms of saying, okay, minimum X% of affordable homes in any project, maybe it's just not feasible anymore from an economic standpoint, and you have no development at all, which doesn't really help the problem. Right, so I think my sort of outreach here is basically more communication between the private and the public sector. Discuss these things. I think sort of just a top-down regulation doesn't always work. Sometimes it's necessary, but it doesn't always work. Right, only a private markets perspective, of course, also doesn't really work.
Do you have in mind good examples of public-private cooperations?
Well, there's, for instance, the German residential market is highly regulated. there's a lot of older residential products. You can't, as a landlord, just raise rents. Everything is regulated. But they do allow you, if you take certain measures like spending maintenance and structural maintenance, making buildings more efficient, within certain guidelines, bandwidths, as a landlord, you're allowed to basically charge 8% of what you actually spend on those measures to the end tenant. Oftentimes, actually, it helps because it decreases the energy bill for the local tenant, right? I think that is something that works well.
That's for the energy part.
Yeah.
And on the social impact, is there anything coming or you see?
Well, sort of it's energy, but it's also social impact because it basically makes a unit more attractive, the well-being of a tenant if something is well insulated. It's just more comfortable to be there. That to me is still it's a social impact. Of course, there's an environmental impact at the same time as well. Fantastic. And then the other example that I would want to give is I personally like a lot the shared ownership model that they have in the UK, which Martijn mentioned at the start of the conversation, where if you just look sort of fundamentally, if you own a house, it's a great inflation hedge. It has been a great inflation hedge throughout sort of decades. But there's a large group of the population that has never been able to benefit from that. Owning a house can also be a great way of accumulating wealth. But again, sort of there's a large part of the population that has never been able to qualify for a mortgage. In the UK, they've said, okay, listen, let's change the model. We have a government subsidized sort of model there. You can buy into a property just for 10%, right? And those are people that generally wouldn't qualify just on the open market for a mortgage to acquire a property outright. So they can acquire 10% property, 10% stake in a home. They rent the remainder from a landlord. And whenever there's free cash, they can staircase their way into the property, lower their rent level essentially, and get exposure to a housing sort of industry, inflation hedge and wealth accumulation that they would normally never get. I think that's a fantastic way of social impact.
And this works because there's a public-private cooperation.
In the end of the day, yes, right? Because it's the private market that owns the remaining part of the house. And allows basically a resident to buy into that building, and there are sort of government regulations around that. So I think that's a great case of public-private cooperation.
Nicolas, yes, you wanted to add on.
I think we have a few examples in Switzerland too. Smaller cities using the leasehold real estate, so providing plot of land. Because we know that, I mean, to achieve lower rent in the end, you have to lower the price of the land. When you pay a high price for the land, then you have to work on the density, and at one stage there is a limit on what you can do. But if you can somehow lower the cost of the land, and that's what a city can do when they have some land, give a leasehold. This allow also then to build and to offer affordable housing, and we saw a few projects in Switzerland in that direction, which is a bit different than offering project where you block the rent for the next 50 years. That's also some other possibilities that we see in Geneva especially. But then when we think about real estate protecting for the inflation and being a hedge to the inflation, if you cannot adapt the rent for 50 years, this can be in the future. So in a point in
it's not a good incentive for private investors to jump in. Let's move on to the third part and this very important point, which is the financial payout of social impact. And there's been lots of discussion when we started years ago when the discussion on ESG investment started. Do we have to sacrifice some of the returns so that we can achieve mostly impact on environment? Same question for social impact. Martin, was there any studies or any evidence that actually the payout is positive, or you indeed have to sacrifice some of the financial return when you run a social impact real estate project?
Yeah, if you look in the spectrum of capital investments, of course you have on the really left side, or the historical side, it was more purely financial. And if you only look at the financials, yeah, you might get the highest returns, especially on the short term. In the last years, you saw, of course, responsible investing, including some activities that are harming. Then you've got sustainable investing, also adding sustainable elements to it. And now you see impact investing coming up since I think several years, maybe since 10 plus years. If you do impact and if you do more than is necessary, it costs money, of course. That's also the additionality element. So in a way, your return will probably be lower than what you did if you would go purely for the short-term financial return. But I think your risk is also lower, and you have to think of, okay, how can I structure it in a way that the risk is lower? And as I told, what we do, especially in the care part, is structure it with a long lease with an operating partner. And then, because you have a longer lease, you have certainty of income. That reduces also your risk of income fluctuations. And then if you look at the risk-adjusted return basis, then it's still fine. So if you have a lower risk, you can compensate also for the lower return due to your impact.
So you're saying it's not just the absolute financial return that we should look at, but it's the risk-adjusted return that matters.
And the longer-term return also.
Nicholas, as an investor, how happy are you with the social impact real estate investment you've made or you plan to make?
I think when we have the right balance, and you mentioned it, and I said it first too. I mean, it's much more about the security of the cash flow than the short-term capital gain. And then it all depends which type of investor you are. I mean, us as asset manager, we have mainly pension fund as clients. They are invested for the next 20 to 30 years. And the security of the cash flow is much more important than the short-term capital gain.
But they do need financial returns to pay the rent and the pensions.
You need it, but it's much more the upfront costs which are higher. Perhaps the project will require more time to come alive because you need to discuss with more stakeholders to bring the project. But once the project is here, I think it's most of the time quite robust than a return. So I don't think we have to compromise too much on the return with social housing. But as long as the social housing is not only about lower rents, because this is not the solution. It's much more bringing affordable housing to a population that everyone can live in a decent house, and quality is also something important. But if we look at the real estate, actually, I mean, the cheapest houses are also most of the time the low quality houses, and that's not what we want for the future. We have also to find the solution. How can we bring the quality of all houses at a standard which also bring everyone in good quality houses.
But you didn't give any figure on what kind of financial payout do we get with social impact real estate?
I mean, it's impossible to say, because if you look in Switzerland, you can invest. I mean, some transaction are with 1.5 net return, and some other at 4.5. So where do social housing then? It's really difficult. But with the example of the leasehold real estate, you can target the same return as in the free market. It's just a question to reduce you will slightly perhaps reduce your cash flow at the start, but you have a much lower vacancies rate risks, and so in the end you will most probably over 10-15 years get exactly the same.
So have long term in mind. Yes, Bertian.
Yeah, I think it's easy to sort of, maybe we're a little bit flawed as an industry, because what we're talking about is financial returns, right? So what's the impact on the financial return of doing impact investing? But I think we should look broader than a pure financial return. I think that's a bit of an old school way of thinking, right? There's a part which is tangible financial. We can easily measure that. But sort of impact investing, there's an intangible return, right? And if you add those two up and potentially a lower risk connected to that, I think we're there. It's the only thing is we can't quantify the intangible.
It's really interesting because it's at the heart of the building bridges discussion. Actually, there's been talks about what's the fiduciary responsibility, and some arguing that we have to look beyond long term, think about the the planet, in others saying, well, I have clients which are teachers' pension fund, and they want return so that they can pay the pension every year, and I can't make this FR. It's difficult to justify. You teachers will have to earn less because I'm thinking about the planet. So it's.
I know a case in the Netherlands where there was one of the largest pension plans have done a survey with their beneficiaries. Okay, what should we focus on with our investments? Should we be focusing only on financial returns, or do you want maybe a slightly lower financial payout at the end, but in a livable world? And it was a very, very clear answer. Now,
put it this way, I guess you can't argue against it.
No, but the flip side. So in my prior job, I was also investing on behalf of a U.S. pension plan and talking about cultural differences. In the U.S. legislation, not for all pension plans, the full fiduciary duty is financial. So if for that plan we would be doing an ESG investment, we could potentially be sued ourselves. We could be held liable by the beneficiaries because our fiduciary duty only, full stop, provide the highest financial payout as possible.
So you mean in the US this is real risk? It's
and that's still the case today. So I feel fortunate that we live in a different part of the world. I love Americans. I love the country. But where we do take note of financial performance, but also sort of a wider social, environmental focus as well. And in the US, of course, there's wide differences between states and stuff. But in particular for the employer-related pension plans, it's full stop. Legislation is financial returns only.
Thank you. François, what's your take on this debate, financial returns, sacrifice, to be sacrificed for social impact? Is this something that you see, or you feel there's a trend coming in the market, that there's a willingness to accept this?
Well, I think a lot has been said on that aspect, but maybe to kind of further Bertian's point, I think the U.S. example is quite evocative of the fact that probably if we want to kind of cut this Gordian knot, we're going to have to kind of internalize the externalities. We can't have a city in which you can just move next door and do something different, and you can't have a system where you don't have a structure to price all these externalities. Since in some places everything is financial, then you have to make the intangible tangible from a legal perspective. So there's probably quite a bit of work to be done, I guess, together on the framework, so that it becomes a constraint, so that you can satisfy your fiduciary duties and kind of maximize the social impact. So if no one can do it on a voluntary basis because they're sometimes legally impaired from doing that, then you have to change the system, because if the system is stopping you from doing the right thing, you have to change the system.
So you're calling for the regulators and public sector to put the framework in place so that this can be...
Well, I would say that it's not just a public sector thing, and I think the question or the survey that was done is very revelatory of what actually people want. Sometimes the public sector thinks people want something, and the private sector may think people want something, but I think the recent kind of energy crisis is also certainly accentuating this idea that we're going to have to do it all together probably, and so we have to stop kind of each fortifying our own little castles, because the sea is coming, and so you can build castles in the sand, but it's not going to be durable.
We'll take questions from the floor in a moment, and from the audience in a moment. Just before this, I have two other topics I'd like to cover with you. One we briefly mentioned, it's how to share the cost between renters and tenants, and in the nitty-gritty of it, what's key when there's an investment, and then how you can share the burden, what makes it work? And Martin, what kind of good practice you have to share with us to make it happen?
Well, I think the current energy price rise is really a good example of that, because for a long time, and that's of course on the green building part, if an investor could make your building greener, but then the tenant would have a benefit of lower energy costs. And now you see that turning, and it was, the discussions were always really difficult. With companies, you could say, okay, we do it both. But for residents, it was more difficult because, especially in the regulated housing sector, and sometimes you saw that it was included, that you got a bit more rent, and that it was, like by Jan was also telling. But now it's getting much more at the forefront, because also, of course, I think especially affordable housing, a lot of tenants will pay more for energy than for the housing costs, and that's a big problem, of course. Then you're trying to fight poverty with lower rents, but then you're getting poverty because of the high energy prices. But now there's also an investment model behind it, so we can invest in it, and you will get lower energy prices. But then the rent will go a bit up, and then the investment also makes sense. Okay. And if you structure that in a kind of responsible way, of course that's important. You don't have to take all the energy price savings because then it doesn't work. But if you do it in a responsible way, I think it's a good combination.
So you're saying that the energy crisis is an opportunity to change the mindset, and then of course we need to change some of the regulation to make it work. But that could prove that there's a win-win in the end. And with those very high energy prices, it shows that maybe it's possible to, or it's in everyone's interest to achieve something.
Yeah, I think it's a small advantage of a disadvantaged situation. Let's put it this way, because it creates an opportunity. But the real problem is quite big, of course, and especially in affordable housing.
Nicholas, your view on sharing those efforts between the renters and the tenants?
I fully agree on that, and unfortunately, it's the case. People are sensitive to the cost. It means to change the behavior, you can. A few percentage will do it themselves, but most of us, it's only a question of the price pressure. And if the price pressure of energy is high enough, this will force somehow people to react and then to find solution. And those solution looks great for the future of the planet, of the living together. And it's probably the sad part of the energy crisis we have.
Mm-hmm. Bertrand, is this something, the share of the burden that you're integrating in the design of the products that you're launching?
I think energy now is at the forefront. Energy efficiency, right? And who has to pick up the bill? I think that's sort of almost a philosophical question, right? It's society at large. So part will likely be borne by tenants that may benefit from lower energy bills, but may then have to pay a little bit higher rents. Part is probably government related, and part is private sector related. I think it's a shared burden, and I do agree that we have to sort of take this very, very unfortunate situation, but turn it into potentially something positive that we can benefit from for decades. And that's basically how we look at it across any products that we think about going forward, for sure.
Thank you. Before there will be a microphone in the room, I don't see them. They will be circulating. And last question on actually, if you have figures to share with us, but what share of your portfolio at the moment is on social impact real estate, and how do you see this share evolving in the coming, say, 5 years from now? Let's start with you, Nicholas.
I think probably a bigger portion than what we think, because we are first of all, now people are communicating much more on that. So, but you have some manager which did social housing in a way for years, but did not really communicate about that.
And in your portfolio, how big of a share?
So I think a few, probably it's a single-digit percentages, and it will increase in the future, because more and more products are created with this thematic. So I think it can be perhaps 10-15% in the future.
And you're looking for new products, or you're developing products yourself?
Yeah, I mean, we internally we have real estate sustainable fund with this thematic, And but the example I gave with Diaticon is in our commercial product, but it's one building, but it's one example. So in the future can be perhaps 2, 3, 4, and in 50 years' time, perhaps all of them. But that's a process, and willing to make things change within a few years, it's impossible. So we also have to give time and see what it makes sense in terms of capex for the next 10, 15 years, because that's how we're going to have the highest impact on that.
Thank you. I don't know if it's Martin or Bertjan who can pick that question too.
Yeah, I think at Rothschild it's now around 10% is social impact.
Okay.
And 90% will be more environmentally based. And also if you look at SFDR 9, the deep green funds, I think that is also around the 10%. But also because the most of our impact funds are actually Article 8, so light, they call it light green. And why is that? Because you want to make impact. And that makes that you have inefficient buildings or not so sustainable buildings. You want to improve that to a sustainable building. And that's your impact action. And Article 9 is all sustainable, so there will be a small part that has been finalized already. And I think we really on purpose also focus on Article 8, on making impact, to make the big step forward, instead of just buying stuff that has already been done. Because you add less to the, you make less impact.
Thank you very much. Yes, please.
Just one thing, obviously we don't have any portfolios to speak of, but one thing that's interesting to keep in mind as well is that at least in Swiss cities, the largest kind of owner of social housing is probably private owners, because their buildings are actually with very low rents. If people have been in their apartments for quite a long time, those are actually the cheapest rents that you can find. So it's important to keep in mind also this kind of underwater part of the iceberg, which is actually all the existing real estate, which actually serves quite a social role without being recognized. and obviously there's now maybe capex needs and things like that, which these private owners are maybe at difficulty to do. But still, most people who live in something they can afford, or we can actually say it the other way around, at least in Switzerland, there's actually not much homelessness. Almost everyone lives somewhere, and most people live in a place that they can afford. And if they can do that, it's because a lot of the rents are actually, I guess, below what the rents would be for new buildings. So that's something to bear in mind in kind of the whole systemic view.
Thank you for adding that point. Happy to take any question. We just need to hit the microphone so that people online can also, the gentleman in the third row over there. Just introduce yourself, please, for the audience.
Yes,
and online.
Jean-Philippe Desmartins, Edmond Rothschild. I have one question, because still some people are criticizing the financial performance of ESG or social impact real estate investment. Do you have an idea, figures in the long term of the financial value of these assets? If you compare with traditional, if I may say, non-social impact assets, how do you see the value of these assets in terms of some results?
I think it's more stable. If you look at the long-term value, it's more stable because your rents are also more stable. And of course, then you have the yields going up and down. But I think because it's stabilized, it's more longer term. The values are also more stable. Yeah, I think that's about it. If you look at it.
Bertjan? Yes.
I think if we look back for the last 10, 15 years, I don't think there has been a lot of discrimination between non-social and social buildings, or non-environmentally friendly buildings or environmentally friendly buildings, because we were living in a declining or low interest rate environment where all asset values would rise regardless. If I look ahead, I think 10 years from now we are going to see that. But at the moment, I think we just lack data points. And we need a lot of data points to make truly a solid case with numbers.
Thank you, gentlemen. Yes, there. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much for the discussion. I really appreciate it. I particularly liked a lot, the mix of indicators.
Just please identify yourself so that we.
Samuel Brown, Celsius Pro. Yeah, so really appreciate all the factors that you mentioned that you take into account for understanding or for assessing what the social impact is. Now, I want to maybe talk about a factor which was not mentioned, and I'd like to ask you about your opinion on that. So, a bit of context before I ask the question. So, with extreme weather events and climate events, people are exposed to these more and more across the whole world, but also in Switzerland, in the US. If you look at pictures from Hurricane Ian, you see lots of big mansions, so very wealthy people being hit. But if you look at Hurricane Katrina, you see New Orleans, where a lot of poor people were hit. So there's also a kind of social relevance in this exposure to these weather events. Now, my question to you would be, is that a factor that you see relevant in this debate? And would it be worth looking at that, or do you already take it into consideration?
You mean the extreme weather events?
Exactly.
How to take them into account?
I think we principally focus on one individual asset, and there you can sort of design buffers maybe for collecting water, those kind of measures you can take. But I think to a large degree, on especially larger examples that you give, we rely on overall government sort of support in terms of protecting against water, protecting against flooding rivers, storms. So it is something we look at with new investments, but we generally look at it on a building by building case, rather than sort of the systemic type risks that we as a house we can't control. We have to be aware of the risks, yes, but we can't really control.
Well, what could be also said, I guess, without necessarily wanting to be polemical, is that a lot of these places that are exposed have been zoned when maybe they shouldn't have been. I'm not necessarily talking about the Florida coast or New Orleans, which are kind of historical things, but if we think in France, where you have sometimes these flood zones where actually maybe short-term gain has caused local authorities to zone places where they know that a centennial flood will wipe the whole place out. So it's not as if we're kind of victims in certain circumstances, or the end users are probably victims, but before that there's a long chain of events that creates a condition for the perfect storm. And even in New Orleans, things could be said about what could have been done. I think the Netherlands are a good example of what to do to protect yourself, maybe from the sea, and some other places maybe you're a little more exposed.
What we can perhaps add is how you have the public sector forcing to protect against a certain risk, or is the market which has to self-regulate. And the market, if you expect the market to self-regulate, the liquid the market is, most probably then the provider will take this into consideration, because the tenant will have the choice to decide between going to this building or this specific one.
Today, you mentioned the Netherlands. My house, I think, is, I don't know how many meters below sea level. But with new zoning, there is an active dialogue at the moment. Like, okay, do we want to build a new neighborhood in this area because we're building something for the next 50 plus years? And there's an active dialogue in the sense of where we actually want to allocate expansions to cities or regions. So it's a live and actual debate.
Thank you. Yes, these are two questions. First, the lady in the second row, and then we go in circle. Yes, the microphone is coming. Yes, thank you.
I was going to refer to the lady in the second row.
No. You can ask your question.
I beg your pardon, it's me in the second
row. No worries.
Sorry. I would like to ask whether there would be any possibility...
Oh, please just identify yourself, if you don't mind.
Sorry?
Identify yourself.
Excuse me. Vera Squin, I'm the founder of a network of people who are trying to find these collective solutions. So working across business, finance, NGOs, UN and others.
Thank you.
I'm based here in Switzerland. I would like to ask whether there is any possibility that the content that has been presented here could be delivered again in the context of a discussion about global development challenges. Because for me, there is a wealth of experience here in Europe, which is already being applied in some parts of the so-called developing world. Mention has been made of conviction, because if there is not a conviction to move to a new system, a new economic model, we're lost. We're just doing more of the same. The ability to accept that we need different measures for risk assessment and for our assessment of our success. And your willingness to trial that even in circumstances where regulatory environments are making that difficult. There is, I think, an opportunity to extend what's being discussed in the world of sustainable or social impact real estate by connecting with local food systems and vertical farming, water and waste management systems that are based on natural solutions, not the industrialized urban infrastructure that we've made the pattern, solar-powered energy, which helps with the vertical farming. So to bring together other parties, to me, would actually enhance the viability of the social impact model and take a little bit of the stigma of the social out of the equation. Because as long as we talk social impact, social housing, we're thinking a kind of compassionate response to people who have less than we do. And we have to end that. Very last comment from me. One remark was made about how currently people, the general public, assess risk. The general public is not typically aware of the imminent danger of catastrophic events around the world, climate change related, but food security, other forms of security. Look at Ukraine. What an opportunity for social impact housing to say, let's get into the reconstruction discussion. There will be billions of dollars thrown at rebuilding Ukraine, but let's not do it in the old way. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments. Answers on bringing other stakeholders. The WEF would say, was mentioned local food farming, water waste facilities in the equation. Martin.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and also especially what you said about Ukraine, and also for all the new builds, you have to think, how are we going to do it in a good and in a sustainable way? And especially new builds, you can do it. You can also alter existing buildings. And especially, of course, water efficiency, waste recycling, those are things that you could really integrate into buildings. Vertical farming, yeah, interesting, but it has to develop, of course. So that it has to do a bit less with buildings. So I don't know that much about it. But I think it's a really interesting concept.
One other thing that can be said is that we're building on the shoulders of giants in our countries, which all these systems have been built up and they've kind of been amortized. And so when we're talking about impact real estate, we're actually taking for granted that we can plug the water into the mains and things like that. So in the countries that you're discussing, obviously you need a highly more integrated solution because they can't rely on all these things which are for them externalities and for us actually are just things we can kind of capitalize on, and they've all been kind of funded collectively throughout the ages, I guess. So certainly if you're building in a place where there is no sewage, then you have to take sewage into account. And if there is no electricity or grid, you have to take that into account as well. Whereas here, obviously, we're talking about the kind of marginal gains that we can apply to buildings that are already, at least in Switzerland, quite energy efficient, quite durable, quite sustainable, and things like that. So there's probably much more to be leveraged in the situations that you described than maybe the situations that we're talking about. And what is portable is maybe an open question. It's not that, I guess, evident.
Thank you, François. Nicolas, you wanted to add something?
I think, I fully agree with you. There are some small initiatives which can be taken, and not only during the construction, but then also during the life of the building and the community. And waste management is something we can think about in a community with hotel, no more plastic, unsold food. What do you do with unsold food in a communities? And probably if you think about those topics when you create the project, you can integrate already the answer to those questions. And that's something which has less to do with financial metrics, but much more about the living together and the community.
We'll go back to the metrics of this impact. Thank you. Lady there.
My name is Anja von Dorp. I work at the World Intellectual Property Organization, where we try to leverage IP and innovation to provide solutions to, well, for instance, address climate change. I want to build on what you said in terms of the adaptation to climate effects, and I think you've distilled quite well the interplay, for instance, when it comes to flooding, about where you can construct. I think in terms of the heat waves, it's a point where I'd like to hear your views, because I mean there's again the city concept levels probably, but there's also an aspect of the construction itself, how you adapt to that, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on that.
Thank you. Who takes?
Well, maybe speaking as an architect, it's interesting to note that we can go back to certain solutions that have maybe been tested and time tested and that are actually no longer used because of
Which one?
being. Well, just the way you conceive of building to maybe, you know, kind of create shade or have greenery on the roof or be oriented correctly in the wind, or even at the city planning level. Maybe some of you are familiar with this Masdar. It's a kind of a pilot project that Norman Foster is building kind of in the desert, where they've kind of gone back to things that are really kind of sustainable in a kind of low energy intensive way. So I think we've always been saved by technology. We were kind of saved from the pandemic through technology with these new kind of vaccines. And if you're leveraging, you know, intellectual property for solutions, that may be some place that we're going to have to look, because obviously the old ways of doing things are probably not gonna manage to solve the global question.
Thank you. So we have still a few questions. We have time for them. I see three of them. Yes, we'll get back to you just after the gentleman in the back.
So my name is Axel Hughes and I'm from the Degroof Petercam Asset Management. Also, we hear a lot that it is difficult to assess how impactful an investment can be. And so to help this transition with more impact investments, with proof of those impacts, do you think that blockchain technology could help assessing the social and green impacts of real estate by gathering as much as data as possible on the projects you showed, for example? Or is it useless because we are able to collect enough data?
Thank you for the question. And the data, we're back to data metrics and the role. Do you see blockchain, is it just a buzzword for you, or it's actually a tool or help to have more data?
Yeah, is it a buzzword or a tool? Blockchain is, of course, a buzzword. Can you use it as a tool? I haven't seen that many applications for social up to date. Of course, for transactions it's possible, but I haven't seen it that much yet. But maybe others have seen it.
Anyone to comment on blockchain?
Being able to gather data in a secure way, an anonymous way, and then, you know, make it circulate so that you can know what you measure could probably be helpful. So in terms of encryption and protecting kind of private data, maybe that's useful. But I don't really see how the system more generally could be useful.
Thank you. Rushing this lady in the third row. Yes. Thank you.
Good morning. I am Rama from Lucerne School of Art and Design. Thank you to all the panelists for your perspectives this morning. My question, any of you can take: what impact do you think real estate startups can offer in social impact real estate that institutional players can't? Or what might credible collaboration look like?
I'm sorry, I'm not sure I got your question. Could you rephrase it? You're speaking about institutional investors?
Yes. What can real estate startups offer which institutional players can't in social impact real estate?
Mm-hmm.
I think they can offer a lot, right? Because real estate as an industry, I think, and that's my personal perspective, we're used to doing things already for decades in a certain manner. So I think startups in any sector have the ability to challenge and create new ways of thinking, of new ways of dealing with issues. So I would welcome any startup with bright ideas, and I think for me personally, it would be fantastic to see something on that end.
Martin, you like to add on? Or innovation, maybe? Or
yeah, well, I refer to what Bejan was saying. I think you can do a lot. We're used also as real estate sector to work in the real environment. So I think you can contribute a lot by communicating, but it's a bit how you work it out also.
Thank you.
I know there's an initiative where there's a VC approach specifically designed for property and trying to decarbonize on the environment but decarbonize the property sector. And that VC fund actually is funded by institutional money. So it's actually sort of bridging those two elements, investing institutional money to help entrepreneurs, startups to build up an idea that hopefully institutions can then take to their benefit. So I think that those kind of initiatives are fantastic.
Thank you. We have time for a last question. The gentleman who's been waiting for quite a while now. Thank you for your patience, sir.
Thank you. And I'll be cheeky and ask two, but hopefully they're concise. In terms of going to
just tell us who you are.
Sorry, Joseph Nine from Calmus Capital. In terms of the verticality of the money supply chain on the high end, how are you seeing structured finance in the debt markets that is very critical to the real estate evolution, incentivizing certain changes? And more downstream, how are you seeing in the construction phase recycling of materials as opposed to the high emission consequences of well, steel in particular, but cement and everything else? I mean, if we're talking about Ukraine, where they're being destroyed, and obviously the technology needed to recycle as opposed to go and use cement, or if China's just destroying it themselves, but the technology needed to have that verticality and the incentive structures accordingly.
Thank you. Thank you. Two questions in a row, the debt one and recycling one. Nicholas?
I think the debt part is an interesting part, and are people willing to pay for social housing, for social investment? The answer is yes, because green bond comes with a lower interest rate than normal bonds. So people are willing to finance those changes. So that would be my answer on this part on the financing. And
on the debt, any other comment or?
Well, I personally haven't seen social bonds yet. So green bonds, yes. I think social bonds outreach to the lenders here. But
social bonds in a positive way,
No, but I think that's why not, right? But I haven't seen the debt market too active in this area.
And the recycling question also, how important is it?
Well, I think more could be done, obviously. It's hard to recycle everything that you need in a new building, so there are some things that can be sustainably sourced rather than recycled. I guess everything that's wood-related is something, but then, of course, forestry is a whole issue in itself. And concrete can be recycled up to a point, and reintegrated into other concrete. But for a lot of the other kind of building materials, it's rather hard. You still can't really replace windows. Obviously, glass is kind of recyclable, but you still have to build them and things like that. We could probably try to move away from PVC use in all the windows and things. But I guess it's a real question. More fundamentally, I think, kind of as I was alluding to at the very beginning, there's obviously a question of how we build, but I think there's almost more leverage to be gained from what we build. How much space do we actually need to house a given population? And if we can save on that, then all things being equal in the way we're building it, we're going to have built less, and we're going to have invested less gray energy in that buildup of whatever project it is. So I think the efficiency can be found at the very beginning, at the planning phase. Let's not build things in places that are going to be exposed to bad weather, or if we can avoid it, let's build the minimum that we need, and then obviously let's build it with the most recyclable materials that we can. But I think you have to start with the kind of large leverage factors, and the question of how much to build is probably more leverageable than the actual question of how much recyclable material can we integrate into our building and construction.
Thank you. Quickly, we have to wrap up, but quickly, Martin, in a few words.
Yeah, and the green building question, I think if you look in the green building segment, the focus is now on operational carbon. So that means the carbon emissions that you emit for heating a building or for the lighting in the operational phase. Next topic, what has been discussed in the past years was embodied carbon. So how much carbon is there if you construct a building? It was always difficult, and you know, a lot of lobby and the concrete industry saying, oh, this is really sustainable and as sustainable as wood. But I think the other advantage of the high energy prices are that you see now factories using a lot of energy, like aluminium factories, steel factories, cement factories shutting down because the energy prices are too high. So now also, and they will of course come back, but you will see that those really carbon intensive and energy intensive building materials will be much more expensive because of the high energy prices. And that also means that the low carbon alternatives like wood will be much more, will have a better price and will be much better affordable also. So I think you will shift now, I see a natural shift towards more carbon, lower carbon materials, so also lower embodied carbon in materials, because the high energy intensive materials like bricks, like steel, glass and aluminium will be more expensive, so will be used less. So I think that's also a small advantage of this situation.
Thank you, Martin.
Intensive.
I'm sorry, we started late also. I'm sorry for that. We're running out of time, and I have to thank you very much, the four panelists, Nicolas of Swiss Finance Property, Bert-Jan Schäfer and Martin Flasfeld from Edmond Rothschild Real Estate Investment Management, and François Yenny of CBRE for all your insights. Thank you very much for your questions. It's been really an interesting discussion. I've been told that we have a half-an-hour break until 11. Please check on BB Connect, the app of Building Bridges, where you're going to at 11, the next workshop. Thank you again for your participation, also for those watching us online. Thank you.